In the year 2025, the first intergalactic kaiju invaded Earth, causing not only colossal danger but also great surprise for the planet's defense forces, who did not know how to deal with that kind of threat, which certainly contributed significantly to the level of destruction. That day, of course, was only the beginning, because soon other kaiju also began to invade the planet, raising the threat to a catastrophic level. Fearing the end of humanity, several nations came together to form an alliance in which soldiers would be trained and prepared specifically for this new type of conflict, thus establishing the Anti-Kaiju Defense Force, the AKIF. With the creation of this organization, some short-term success was achieved, but it was not enough to permanently eliminate the enemies that continued invading the planet and threatening humanity's future. The situation kept getting worse, and hope faded with every casualty, until one day, a young boy appeared as a savior for all humankind. Curiously, before becoming who he is today, that boy was extremely shy, almost to the point of being antisocial. While other children played at being members of the AKIF, he always stayed out of it and could not bring himself to join, even when invited. In social situations, young Yabusama struggled considerably and simply could not interact properly. Yet that did not stop him from having his own feelings, which were often overlooked because of the isolation he lived in. One day, Yabusama came across a giant robot that, surprisingly, was protesting to preserve its own life, because, according to it, it would be launched like a bomb to explode in the middle of the kaiju. And that was something it did not want to happen. Because of the commotion, the respected scientist Kajika Yabusame was called to resolve the situation and listen to what the robot had to say, since it was preventing the other AKIF scientists from entering the laboratory. However, despite the machine's plea, Kajika maintained his stance that the robot should be used simply as a bomb. After all, it had been built for that purpose and should fulfill that role, nothing more. Even though it clearly displayed complex personality traits, behaving almost like a human being to a certain extent. In the scientist's mind, the machine was the key to winning the war without putting more humans at risk. Other scientists, however, viewed his discovery with skepticism, since he had spent a tremendous amount of money developing the machine and often behaved obsessively about his research, which was not well regarded among his colleagues. In any case, after carefully observing that scene, young Yabusame decided to take an action that would change his life forever. Feeling sorry for the giant robot, the boy hid inside the laboratory and approached it. Around them, alarms sounded, signaling a new kaiju attack. While the scientist could hardly wait to test the snowman, however, he was informed that, apparently, Yabusame's own son had entered the robot, which could jeopardize everything. Confident in his invention, the scientist assured everyone that the control cockpit had been designed only for training and could only be operated by a true genius. Having read much of the snowman's instruction manual, young Yabusame managed to take a few timid steps while controlling the machine until he finally lifted off with the robot, leaving the scientists in shock, especially his father, who shouted Tetsuo's name in desperation. At the same time, the man realized that perhaps the genius he had referred to was, in fact, his own son. Hours later, the media began broadcasting wonderful news, as if by a miracle. A robot had appeared in the middle of the battle and defeated the monsters, and most incredible of all, it was being controlled by nothing more than a 9-year-old boy. Since his son had been inside the machine, Dr. Yabusame was summoned to give a public explanation about the event. But he found himself in a difficult position, because the public had begun to see the boy and his robot as true national heroes. If his original plan had been to simply detonate the machine, he could no longer admit that on national television. Therefore, he lied, claiming that the duo's involvement had been part of the AKIF's plan from the beginning and that they would continue on the front lines against the kaiju threat. After realizing what he had done, Tetsuo could barely breathe from the tension. However, after 10 years of this endless battle, he had become an extremely competent warrior, admired by the population and seen as a true hero and humanity's main force against the intergalactic enemies. Snowman, too, had been upgraded, gaining new weapons and a more powerful design. With that strength, the Anti-Kaiju Defense Force felt confident enough to launch an operation called the Final Battle, in which Tetsuo and Snowman would, of course, play a crucial role. Meanwhile, as he read his manual about how to overcome the 777 obstacles and make friends, Tetsuo was alerted by an intergalactic cruiser that the operation would begin in 40 minutes and that he should board Snowman immediately for the mission. Tired of it all, the boy left his room and was called by 2 women who wished good luck to the savior of humanity. However, despite being an established hero, Tetsuo had still not overcome his enormous difficulty with social interaction. He stumbled badly while trying to respond to the girls and ultimately fled to avoid facing the embarrassment. On one hand, he was a formidable fighter. On the other, he was completely inept when it came to communicating with others. He ran toward the robot Yukio as if he needed a shoulder to lean on after yet another awkward incident. The robot already knew he had done something embarrassing again, but understood that the reason for his antisocial behavior was that he had spent most of his childhood fighting monsters from another planet instead of learning how to talk to people like a normal boy. Not that Tetsuo had ever been particularly good at social interaction before, but that experience had certainly made it worse. As a result, Yukio was essentially the only friend he had, especially because, in Tetsuo's mind, he still had to overcome the 777 obstacles to gain a true friend, or at least, that was what the book by the writer Lonely Iwaki, How Even a Kaiju Can Make Friends, claimed. Yukio thinks the books are far too lacking in objectivity, but he is interrupted by a transmission from Captain Mist, who informs them that the two of them will soon be launched to the front lines against the kaiju horde. Quickly reviewing the plan, their role is to attract and gather the monsters so the cruiser can fire the infinite laser, the main weapon humanity developed to destroy its enemies once and for all. Truth be told, it will be a major challenge, since no one knows exactly how long it will take for the laser to be ready. Even so, Yukio promises they'll get the job done. Mist feels reassured and ends the transmission not before Tetsuo agrees that they'll give it their all. Or at least, that's what he should have said. Once again, he acted awkwardly and stumbled over his words, even though the people aboard the cruiser were impressed just by hearing the voice of the nation's hero. Tetsuo himself always felt embarrassed whenever he had to play that corny role. In any case, this is no time to feel embarrassed. The kaiju horde has just appeared, and it is anything but small. In fact, it is infinitely larger than the two of them could have imagined. Practically an endless swarm, painting the sky like a cloud of monsters flying straight toward their targets. Breaking into a cold sweat, Mist orders the mission to begin, but Tetsuo, always feeling undervalued, lowers his head and lets the monsters approach at full speed without reacting, leaving the captain desperate and even Yukio confused, unable to understand the boy's behavior. Even so, at the last second, Tetsuo begins the battle. He activates the drone sword along with the robot's seventh style, known as the Root of the Rainbow. Armed with unmatched power, Snowman begins annihilating kaiju through space as if he were the most feared samurai in the history of the universe. The crew aboard the intergalactic cruiser celebrates the awakening of the famous Tetsuo Yabusame in battle, their greatest hope of winning this war. However, for that to happen, they must also take action. They begin preparing the long-awaited infinite laser, while the ship is protected by a powerful energy shield. When everything is finally ready, Mist orders the laser to be fired and smiles, hopeful that humanity will be saved and that she will finally return to Earth and to the life she once had. But the infinite laser not only fails, it drains all the cruiser's energy, leaving the ship without shields and without engines, completely adrift and vulnerable to a kaiju attack. What follows is the tragedy that had already been looming. Without the barrier protecting the cruiser, the monsters invade easily and devastate the vessel, leaving the humans with no chance to react. Within moments, the command cabin is breached, and the crew members are sucked into space except for Mist, who manages to stay secured by her seatbelt. But her luck quickly runs out, as the intergalactic cruiser cannot withstand the massive damage and suffers countless explosions. From a distance, Tetsuo and Snowman witness the scene and reach a single conclusion: the mission has failed, and now they will die as well. Since their only way out alive was for the infinite laser to work, and everything has literally gone into space. Even so, since they are still there, they refuse to go down without a fight. They fire relentlessly and fight bravely until the very last drop of sweat. After a long time, space is filled with hundreds of mutilated kaiju bodies. But as expected, all the effort in the world is not enough for Tetsuo and Yukio to contain the endless horde. Snowman is barely able to move from the damage he has taken. It is clear that fighting is no longer possible, only waiting for the end. But not just any end. The end Kajika intended for Snowman. The self-destruction protocol that had originally been designed for him 10 years earlier. Tetsuo widens his eyes when the robot mentions this, but he knows there is no other escape. He tries to figure out from the manual how to activate the explosion so he can die alongside his friend. Overcome with emotion, Yukio comments that his partner is about to pass on without ever having made friends. Offended, Tetsuo replies that having the robot as his partner was more than enough. For a moment, memories of his childhood flood his mind, always sidelined, struggling to communicate with others. At some point, however, he simply stopped letting it bother him. If everyone else had friends, that was fine. Tetsuo had learned to handle loneliness just as well as he handled Snowman's controls. In his mind, he may die now in this war against the kaiju, but he already won the battle against himself. As if it were not enough that he was naturally shy, his childhood had been stolen after he unintentionally committed an act of heroism and was suddenly elevated as humanity's last hope. Now he floats in space, surrounded by thousands of monsters alone. But not entirely, because he still has Yukio. In fact, if anyone feels grateful for that, it is Snowman himself. Tetsuo was the only one who never treated him like just a robot, even giving him a human name. The first thing that worries him is whether he'll be able to make new friends, given the generational conflict he's about to face. Since each generation changes its customs so drastically from one to the next. In any case, he steps out of the cabin to see what the world looks like and finds a crowd of people celebrating the appearance of the great hero of the world. At that moment, the boy realizes he managed to keep the promise he made to Yukio to make lots of friends. Well, at least that's what he wishes had happened. In reality, he's only just now sticking his head out of the cabin, and he's met with a world completely frozen over. Unable to believe what he's seeing, Tetsuo can only think that Yukio gave his life to save the Earth and now everything is devastated. Just when he finally returned. For a moment, he considers the possibility that only the city of Shizuoka has fallen into an ice age. He goes back inside the cabin to look for a live image of the planet, but is left stunned when he discovers that the entire Earth is in the same condition. Tetsuo cannot understand how everything could have frozen over in a span of 10 years, an entire civilization buried under ice, when the FDAK had been in such a good phase. On top of that, one of the things that truly hits him is the promise he made to Yukio that he would make friends. But it doesn't seem like anyone is alive in this world. Next, we move to a dream where Tetsuo is back at his old school, in the infirmary area, sitting on a chair while repeatedly drawing the symbol of the moon. Some classmates notice him and comment among themselves that it's strange for Yabusama to be practicing calligraphy there, since the savior isn't even allowed to attend school. In truth, many young people would give anything to take his place and not have to study, but even so, this strange guy keeps doing it. At that moment, Tetsuo sees a bizarre image of his father stating how important his son is because of what he is capable of doing. But just as the scientist is about to explain exactly what that means, the boy wakes up 22 hours later with the hunger of 15 beggars. Imagining that there must be rations and supplies in the back of the cabin, the pilot gets up in search of food. But as he stands, he accidentally presses a button that activates a recording of Yukio's image and voice. In the message, the robot says that his dream was never about high-quality oil, but rather about Tetsuo having a normal, happy life filled with friends when he returned to Earth. Motivated by his friend's words before the explosion, Tetsuo puts on cold weather clothing, eats, and then leaves the cabin in search of a survivor. In his mind, the answer he's looking for is in the book he has read hundreds of times, How Even a Kaiju Can Make Friends, and the first step is simply leaving home to socialize. Curiously, after only a short walk, Tetsuo is startled to identify the presence of an elderly man, as he was certain he wouldn't find anyone so soon. However, lacking any real social skills, he ends up tripping in the snow and bumping into the man, who crumbles apart as if he were a clay statue. Faced with the situation, Tetsuo gives the old man's remains a proper burial and prays for his soul. By the way, the man had been on top of a small excavator that, surprisingly, was still functioning and still had fuel. This gives Tetsuo the opportunity to continue his journey using the machine, controlling its shovel, something he gradually learns how to operate along the way. Without a doubt, it will be extremely important equipment for facing the Ice Age. Speaking of the excavator, he comes across a gigantic hole in the ground. Since his priority is to find some kind of human shelter in minimally habitable condition, he thinks that perhaps the answer lies underground, as it would be warmer and offer better conditions for human life at this temperature. He approaches the hole and prepares to shout so someone might hear him, but quickly remembers that he isn't capable of shouting to a crowd of strangers due to his extraordinary shyness. No one will ever want to be friends with a guy like him. Maybe he could at least befriend a dog or a cat if any are still alive. Suddenly, in the middle of his troubled thoughts, Tetsuo is surprised by the appearance of an intergalactic kaiju. Faced with the gigantic beast, all the poor boy can do is quickly climb into his excavator and try to get away. It is obvious that the vehicle does not have enough speed to outrun the creature, nor enough strength to fight it. Still, as he attempts to escape, he ends up falling into another hole and crashing hard onto the ground. When he realizes what happened, he finds himself in a kind of underground human settlement just as he had imagined might exist. However, what he did not expect to find was that the ice had reached down there as well. Houses and apartments, everything frozen. Tetsuo believes he may even be close to his own home and feels the sadness of recognizing the destroyed environment. At that moment, the ground begins to shake as the kaiju approaches. Knowing this, Tetsuo shows strong determination and once again lifts his mini excavator to face the beast head-on. If he seems to be at a clear disadvantage due to the enemy's size, one thing that may help balance the fight is the fact that he can reason through his strategy and recalculate in real time as the battle unfolds. For example, after suffering the kaiju's first attack, Tetsuo analyzes that its strikes are linear and relatively easy to dodge, although he cannot counterattack effectively. Using his experience as a pilot, he quickly adapts to the excavator and maneuvers the shovel in a way that protects him efficiently, all while thinking of a way to strike back and win the fight. Even so, it is obvious that it won't be easy. Kaiju are massive creatures, and with the strength this one possesses, the excavator's shovel begins to take serious damage. The pilot needs to find a solution quickly. In the end, the saying, "Every cloud has a silver lining," proves true, precisely because he loses the shovel at that moment in the fight. Tetsuo ends up with a powerful pointed stake as a weapon. He charges at the kaiju like a knight wielding a lance. As he does, he remembers that his father once told him he is important because he is capable of killing kaiju. With that in mind, the boy drives straight into the monster's mouth at full speed and pierces its head from the inside. The jaws close, preventing his escape, and at that moment, 3 humans arrive in the area. 2 of them are astonished to see a giant kaiju there, imagining that the demolition squad will be shocked. One of the women comments that they've hit the jackpot, and that's why the other 2 throw Chief Nogi into the air in celebration. However, the trio's small celebration is cut short when the savior of humanity emerges from the beast's mouth in a rather unusual way. Overjoyed to see other humans, Tetsuo reacts with exaggerated enthusiasm. While the 3 of them believe they're facing a blood-soaked monster or an evil spirit, the man and the little girl hide behind Chief Nogi as if she were a shield, until Nogi herself snaps out of it and shouts that this weirdo is a human being. At the same time, Tetsuo tries to remember what the next step in his book about making friends was after meeting someone. Then he recalls that he's supposed to smile. However, the way he does it only makes him look even stranger and more suspicious, especially since he's staggering like a zombie. With no strength left to remain standing, Tetsuo finally collapses to the ground. Next, we see Yukio complaining about another one of Tetsuo's self-help books, saying they aren't as practical or objective as they claim to be. Tetsuo defends it, arguing that the book is solid, since it was written by none other than Lonely Iwaki, a man famous for having millions of friends. Snowman doesn't buy it, and Tetsuo admits he's stuck on the second step. When he reads what he's supposed to do, he realizes he isn't capable of doing that with a stranger. On top of that, he believes no one would find him interesting if Yukio isn't with him. In the end, when Tetsuo wakes from his deep sleep, the step he thought he wouldn't be able to accomplish turns out to be simply introduce yourself. When he notices he's inside a frozen cave, he's certain he's been taken to the kaiju's lair, but he quickly remembers that he encountered survivors, so they must be somewhere nearby. Finally, he looks back and sees an entire team working on the dead kaiju's body, dozens of men doing something that, at the moment, the pilot has no idea about. Even so, Tetsuo's goal is to make friends with them. He tries to stand up, only to realize his arms are tied behind his back. However, as the savior of humanity, he has dislocated his shoulders several times while piloting Yukio because of the G-force, so he manages to maneuver his arms forward like a rag doll. Meanwhile, Nishimura, the leader of the dismantling squad, is pleased that they found leather, meat, and bones in this free carcass they came across, which, according to him, left everyone at the center extremely excited. Nogi would love to take credit for discovering the carcass, but she knows that won't be possible. Nishimura reassures her, saying the report won't mention who found it anyway. As always, Nogi continues exploring without permission, and once again the squad leader has to cover for her. If the elders find out that their star leaves the center every night to explore the kaiju's lair, they'll certainly lose their minds. Regardless, Nogi says the important thing is to keep fighting. Hearing that, Nishimura becomes emotional, remembering that she is the little girl he once found crying alone. Nogi grumbles that she's not a child anymore, she even has subordinates under her command. Speaking of which, the two fools she commands rush in to report that the guy they tied up has escaped. Curiously, Tetsuo hasn't run away at all. On the contrary, he's taking this whole friendship thing far too seriously. So he decided to remain in the same place as the people who imprisoned him, all to see if he can make a new friend. Watching how the workers handle the carcass and make do with whatever tools they have, the pilot concludes that a kaiju can truly provide valuable resources for survival in a completely frozen world. Tetsuo is moved by how incredible these people are for surviving in such a harsh era, but his tears are interrupted by a small child playing with a robot similar to Yukio. When the child hits him with the toy, Tetsuo doesn't know how to react and simply extends his hand in an instinctive gesture. The boy runs off laughing and calling him a weirdo, which Tetsuo takes in stride. However, an icicle threatens to fall on the boy's head. The pilot quickly rushes toward him. On the way, he grabs one of the large bones removed from the kaiju and, using the robot sword style, destroys the icicle before it can hit the child. Immediately, the boy begins to cry. His father, who had been working nearby, stops everything to hug him and lightly scolds him for once again walking under the icicles. At the same time, two twin workers thank the stranger for the help and mention that the boy's father has been more emotional than usual because he recently lost his wife. They then take a closer look at the man in front of them and ask who on earth he is, since they've never seen him at the shopping district. When confronted like that, Tetsuo is reminded of how much of a failure he is at making friends, and his loneliness once again dictates his behavior, as he can barely answer through his stuttering. However, the boy's father knocks the twins on the head and says the young man must have his reasons, and that they owe him one, so it doesn't matter who he is or where he came from. With that, the man extends his hand and introduces himself as Takemura, Joji's father. Tetsuo can't bring himself to shake his hand, so Takemura stretches his arm out further to complete the greeting. In the end, even if awkwardly, Tetsuo manages to accomplish the step of introducing himself. After learning his name, Takemura says he'll give him the finest cuts of kaiju meat as thanks for saving Joji. The twins warn that Nishimura will finish them off if he finds out, but the bald man replies that now they're involved too, so they'd better keep their mouths shut. At the same time, Nogi and his two subordinates watch the prisoner from a distance. The big guy asks if it wouldn't be better to capture him again, but Nogi replies to Furumachi that their duty is simply to deal with threats to them all, and considering how well he's being received by the demolition squad, they can listen to the stranger's side of the story afterward. With that said, Nogi calls the pair over to help with the dismantling, but at that exact moment, another kaiju suddenly appears inside the cavern. The moment Tetsuo lays eyes on the creature, even he is left in shock. After all, its bone structure doesn't resemble anything he has ever seen before. Watching that disturbing expression on the monster's face, Tetsuo tries to understand how they evolved to this point. At that moment, the kaiju slams its hand down on several workers and, after crushing them, licks the blood from its hand. Tetsuo has no idea how he can defeat something of that size without Yukio and without the excavator, so he decides to ask the twins how they usually take down something like this. However, the men are completely paralyzed with fear and can't say a single word, which suggests that they have never seen anything like this either. In that case, Tetsuo decides that the priority is to get these people out of there. But even that seems like an impossible mission. When one of the workers suddenly runs, the boy tries to stop him, but it's too late. The kaiju stretches out its arm to crush the man, and everything seems over for him. However, Nogi appears at high speed and manages to push her colleague away and save him. After that, Nogi simply slams her head against the ground, leaving herself even more mentally shaken. In the end, it is all a lament on her part because someone died in front of her. In any case, Furumachi and the little girl arrive with smoke machines and tell their boss to worry about that later. Focused on the moment, Nogi orders the emergency machines to be activated. A massive curtain of smoke begins to fill the cave. At the same time, she grabs a megaphone and tells all the idiots to run as if there were no tomorrow. Without delay, the entire battalion of workers starts running toward a net that could be climbed to reach the surface. The head of the demolition squad orders everyone to remember their training, while Tetsuo is impressed by the synchronization and discipline of those workers who already knew exactly what to do. On the other hand, when he looks at the kaiju again, Tetsuo feels a chill down his spine that is not exactly fear, but rather the result of his vast fighting experience alongside Yukio. When the beast begins to twist its body, there is a terrible feeling that something very bad is about to happen. The savior of the nation thinks he should do something before more people die, But now he is just a simple man standing in front of a gigantic beast. He is no longer the pilot of Snowman, who goes into space with blades the size of buildings and dismembers kaiju. As if seeing himself as useless, someone who did not even deserve to keep living, Tetsuo lowers his head in the middle of the fog. But Takamura shouts for him to get out. When the boy turns to look at him, the twins join in and start shouting for him to run as well. However, the boy's unrestrained mind, remembering the handshake with Takamura, acts contrary to what was asked and runs toward the kaiju to draw it to the other side. Takamura almost runs after him but is stopped by his friends. The tactic works, and the monster begins to follow Tetsuo, who barely escapes a crushing blow from the beast. Nogi watches in disbelief as an ice cap, after being struck by the monster, flies toward the boy and hits him hard in the back. In addition, the kaiju's intense agitation begins to compromise the cave's structure itself, making a collapse an imminent reality. Even so, Nogi decides to save the man who sacrificed his life for the others. Tetsuo lies sprawled on the ground, practically helpless after the strong blow to his back, while the kaiju grabs him and literally holds him in its hands, already without strength to react. Suddenly, a chip on the pilot's face is activated, and the ceiling collapses completely. What happened is that Tetsuo's capsule forced its way in and fell directly onto the kaiju's arm that was holding the boy. A few minutes earlier, 42 minutes had passed since the landing of the ejection capsule. After accumulating a massive amount of data, the system was finally installed and initiated. Automatically, the coordinates identified the pilot's position, allowing the capsule to go directly to him. Coincidentally, this happened at the exact moment Tetsuo needed it most. To make things even better, the boy thought he heard Yukio's voice while he was on the verge of death. Perhaps it was only his mind hallucinating near the end, but one very real thing was the capsule invading the cave. In the end, it was a fact that the last safeguard Yukio had left behind, in case death separated him from his pilot, had been activated. He never thought he would have to use that trump card, but since not everything happens the way we would like, there it was, standing before the enormous kaiju. Snowflake, the younger brother of Snowball, but still Yukio in a different combat skin. 14 years earlier, during a kaiju invasion of Earth, Japan's dynamic duo was sent to contain the threat. But the prototype's movements were completely jammed. When Tetsuo confronted his father, the scientist admitted that he might have forgotten to perform maintenance the day before. On top of that, the famous Dr. Kajika had simply swapped the oil tank with the water tank, meaning he basically gave oil for his son to drink inside the robot's capsule. Even after harming his son to that extent, the father only told him to hold on while the kaiju bit down hard on Yukio's head. Thinking about it now, the feeling the boy has when Yukio holds him in his hands again is that the emptiness inside him has just been slightly filled by the sense of partnership that practically built his identity as a person. Using his thrusters, the robot reaches a speed high enough to headbutt the kaiju and knock it to the ground. Even at just 1/10 of its former size, the current Snowflake was still good enough for the job and needed to prove that in the face of such a dangerous threat. Although he lost his strongest prototype, Yukio was able to transfer his personality into the capsule before the self-destruction. The installation, of course, took quite some time, but now he could say with complete certainty that he was standing before his pilot once again, and it was possible to see traces of emotion in that figure that was supposed to be nearly artificial. Meanwhile, being the good human that he is, Tetsuo Yabusame cried through every opening his body was capable of producing tears from, because he was standing before his first and only friend. Setting that aside for a moment, the blow Yukio delivered to the kaiju's arm upon arriving in the cave caused a brutal open fracture, but the creature was terribly persistent and showed no signs of abandoning the fight. Facing a being that seemed consumed by rage, Yukio mocks its anger. After all, no kaiju that had faced him and Tetsuo had escaped alive so far. And even though Snowflake now had far fewer weapons and much less strength, the same thing would happen to this monster. Hearing this, Tetsuo asks if things are really that bad for the robot. He replies that he is indeed much weaker than before, but just having arms and legs again is already a major advantage enough for the two of them to be fine. In the middle of this, while Furomachi tries to understand why that kid is talking to a robot, Nogi tells everyone to stay back. For good reason, because at that exact moment the kaiju takes on an attack posture and begins to stiffen its body, assuming the expression of a predator. Using its legs to propel itself, the monster lunges at impressive speed, but Yukio had already predicted the movement and was agile enough to avoid the strike. which, according to the robot himself, would have finished him right there. In fact, the impact of the kaiju hitting the wall was so devastating it seemed enough to make the cave collapse entirely. Seeing this, the humans who escaped begin to think there is no hope for the pilot. Doubt starts to spread among them, until Nishimura, going against that feeling, states that everything will be fine. After all, they have seen this before. Then, when the kaiju repeats the same lunge with crushing speed, Tetsuo and Yukio combine on a tactic that will decisively change the fight. Even though the monster flew forward like a bullet, the pilot and the robot deliver. During a spinning evasive maneuver, a sword strike that lands cleanly on the enemy's neck and begins pressing the cut downward, gradually beheading the target. With the one-sword robot style, using the Octopus Diablo technique, the Japanese prototype was able to cut off the beast's head. As they see the fight end, people begin celebrating wildly, while Nogi cannot help but admire the impressive display of skill from the two of them. After all, they delivered the strike at the same time they spun to evade the attack, certainly a cinematic maneuver. Meanwhile, about 100 miles from the battlefield, in a completely frozen Tokyo, a humanoid kaiju observes the city's devastation with a calm yet unsettling expression. After organizing a return expedition, the members of the demolition squad take Tetsuo and Yukio to the center, which fills the boy with anticipation, since he had longed for civilization in this world taken over by ice. On the other hand, Yukio seems more concerned about the fact that the entire planet froze in just 10 years, remembering that he landed on Earth alone and went through all that trouble in such a short time. Tetsuo cannot hold back his emotions and admits how relieved he is to have his best friend back by his side. The robot asks the human to stop crying every time they talk, because he ends up crying too, which indeed happens as tears of oil leak from his eyes. Meanwhile, the little girl who works under Nogi comments to her boss that the big robot really is incredible, but she has disappeared. In fact, Nogi goes over to Tetsuo and offers him a can of pineapple, since, according to her, that is what people use to celebrate nowadays. As Yukio encourages his friend to mess up his communication with the others, Tetsuo completely glitches, not knowing how to react to the situation. Nogi adds that the item is quite valuable and that it is not just pineapple. When she opens the can, she smells it and, moved, asks if the boy can smell it too. Seeing the woman treat the item as if it were a divinity, Tetsuo wonders whether he can really eat it. And Nogi herself shows clear signs of confusion about that, since she ends up letting it slip that she does not want him to eat it. However, after a tense internal struggle, the girl concludes that he saved everyone, so it is only fair that they repay him with something worth as much as their lives. Tetsuo thinks she exaggerated a little with that comparison, but since he is not there to question it, he takes one of the slices of canned pineapple and eats it. Nogi feels it as if she had taken the bite herself, then justifies that it is simply the pain of seeing the number of pineapples in the world being reduced live. In that case, Yukio suggests that the two of them eat together, and the girl accepts the proposal before Snowball can even finish his sentence. After they finish the can, Nogi thanks the gods, in the plural, which startles the boy. Realizing this, she quickly changes the subject and claims that she came not only to give the pineapple, but also to introduce herself and share important information. With a handshake, she says her name is Aonogi and that her favorite food is sweet bean paste. Seeing how she reacted earlier to that can, Yukio can only imagine how she would act if her favorite food were pineapple. In any case, Nogi offers to tell them what happened 10 years ago, so Tetsuo, even tense with the whole situation, goes ahead and asks for an answer. At that time, on a quiet beach in Japan, beachgoers thought they had seen a kaiju at the bottom of the sea, and it should be said that it was far from a normal creature, especially because it had a humanoid form and because it had come from space instead of the sea, as is usual. In addition, the monster was accompanied by a white, floating sphere. Observing the movement, two amphibious model snowmen prepared to defend the population, but they began to freeze from inside their robots, even at that absurd distance. At the same time, the kaiju multiplied its white spheres several times and threw them against the world, spreading those mysterious figures to every existing corner. Then, once the spheres were firmly positioned, they exploded like a cold bomb, covering the Earth with a curtain of ice that embraced the entire extension of the planet. Since then, the Earth has never warmed again and remains in that condition to this day. Tetsuo and Yukio ask what happened to the anti-kaiju defense force, because such a well-organized institution could not have been defeated so easily. However, Nogi reinforces the idea that everything happened so quickly and so overwhelmingly that not even the most powerful human institutions had any chance. The ERDE, for example, suffered disastrous losses in the first wave, and those who survived struggled to protect the people. But it did not take long before kaijus began falling from the sky and finished the job. Or rather, Nogi does not believe that all the members of the organization were exterminated, and there is even a rumor about the existence of a center for ERDE survivors, which is said to be in a power dispute. In the end, after that disturbing story, Yukio and Tetsuo feel a hint of hope that they might reunite with some old companions. Sometime later, Nogi informs the newcomers that they are arriving at the center, and Furumachi asks Tetsuo not to disappoint in his reaction. Being called by his first name fills the boy with happiness, since he feels that he belongs to the group, which had been his greatest concern. According to Nogi, they are about to enter the only place on Earth where it is possible to sleep safely. Soon, inside a huge fissure that existed in the middle of a mountain of ice, the group reaches the Mishima Center. At first glance, the girl apologizes in case the building, which looks like a school, is disappointing. But Tetsuo is truly amazed to discover that many people live there. As the pilot approaches with his robot, the residents of the center spread the news of the Savior's return, and possibly of someone from the ERDE as well. Curious to understand exactly what was happening, many locals personally go to the entrance of the glacier, forming a crowd around Snowball. While moved by all those people, Tetsuo worries about how he will be received, until, as soon as he finishes speaking, he sees the entire crowd raising their arms and welcoming him and his robot. The people even ask the boy to give a speech, but he completely freezes and leaves it for later. As soon as he climbs down from Yukio, the boy hears from Nogi that approximately 200 people live there, each with their own role. For example, some are responsible for bringing resources from the outside world, while others improve the center's infrastructure. Nogi, in turn, is the head of the accounting department, which confuses Tetsuo, since she had been in the middle of that battle. Regarding that, Furumachi shows up to explain that the woman is absolutely not allowed to leave the rift, yet she keeps sneaking out anyway. Seeing the leaders of the center furious with her, Nogi calls Furumachi and Shinjo over so they can be scolded along with her. Before leaving Tetsuo, however, she tells him that the old man will look after him since it was his own request. The old man, in this case, was Mr. Takamura. Right away, he shows the outsider the hot spring they have at Mishima Center, something that leaves Tetsuo completely stunned, since he definitely did not expect to find something like that there. Ever since he set foot inside the center, the boy has worn the same dumbfounded expression, especially when he's invited to get into the hot spring right then and there. As soon as he enters the water and enjoys the temperature, the pilot wonders why the center is warm, since it's the only place he's found so far that isn't covered in snow. Noticing that the kid seems troubled by something, Takamura explains that there is a kaiju buried beneath Mishima Center. He says there's no need to panic, but Tetsuo must first hear the story of the kaiju tamer who saved them all. 11 months after the Great Glaciation, the moment the world was covered in ice, well-known members of the center, such as Nishimura and Takemura, arrived with their group at number 4 high school. Once again, however, they were disappointed to discover it was just another territory taken over by kaiju. Cold, hunger, and exhaustion consumed everybody, and even though they occasionally managed to find shelter in a mall or a school, they were soon driven out whenever a kaiju appeared. That only deepened the feeling that the end was near. One day, when the group was practically starving to death, someone found the carcass of a kaiju, which served as food for everyone. Even so, half of the group died from eating it. Only the bodies that did not reject the extraterrestrial meat survived. In addition, some chose not to take the risk and died from hunger and cold. Despite everything, the group continued their journey, even after so many losses. At that stage, Nogi was very ill, and some members argued that the best option was to leave the girl behind. She had been like that ever since she ate the kaiju meat, and there was no hope left for her. However, her teacher at the time refused to do that and cared for his student as best as he could. On top of that, the dangers of the outside world had not disappeared. In fact, on that very same day, the group was surrounded by 2 kaiju. Fortunately, the 2 monsters were facing each other and seemed more concerned with one another, which allowed the humans to escape. However, in the panic, the teacher ended up dropping Nogi in the middle of the beasts. Takamura did everything he could to go back and save the little girl, but the others held him back with all their strength and stopped him from doing something reckless. For some reason, abandoned to her fate, sick and defenseless among the monsters, Nogi's hair suddenly turned white. Ever since she ate that meat, she had been hearing voices in her head, and that moment was no different. A male voice remarked that the girl had been abandoned to die and would certainly be devoured by a kaiju. In any case, the voice was interested in this thing called emotion, and in how a person faced death. Since to him it seemed exciting, Nogi, of course, repeated several times that she did not want to die in a place like that she still wanted to attend a graduation ceremony in her school uniform, maybe fall in love someday, or even compete in the Olympics. Her father, her mother, and Makoto were gone, so Nogi felt alone and afraid. Still, perhaps she could turn this around and find some kind of joy in this end-of-the-world scenario. Terrified of dying, the child tried to think about sweet bean paste to calm her overwhelming anxiety, but it was impossible to find peace, since the voice in her head seemed to feed on her despair, observing her suffering as if she were a lab rat, curious to see her experience fear, helplessness, and even hatred toward the friends who left her behind. However, even after what had happened, Nogi refused to hate her friends. On the contrary, she said she loved them. Surprised, the voice asked whether all humans were like that. She said she didn't know, but that was how she felt about Mr. and Mrs. Takamura. For example, since they always shared their food with the children, even her teacher, who was a cowardly man, still gave everything he had to protect everyone. Kashiki, even though he sometimes frightened Nogi with his rough demeanor, cried endlessly whenever someone died. Having lived alongside those people and felt all the drama so intensely, Nogi could feel nothing but love for them people who shared that brutal experience with her, which, at times, still contained a small hope that something good might happen. Then, overcome by a sense of heroism and imagining herself as the pilot of a snowman about to save humanity, the little girl stood up and promised to become the front line that would help her friends. When one of the kaiju turned toward her and roared, she did not flinch and declared that she would tear the beast apart from the inside out. However, when the monster attacked the human, it was not she who performed a miracle or managed to fight back. In truth, the creature responsible for the voice inside her was the other kaiju, which anticipated the enemy's attack and knocked it down with its claws. After that, the winged kaiju seemed overtaken by a mix of fury and excitement at the behavior of that little girl. Although it saw humans as pathetic, it found it absolutely intriguing that a child so small had placed herself on the front line to protect her kind at the brink of death, even without the slightest chance of winning. As it sheathed itself in flames like a phoenix, the monster established a bond between itself and Nogi, making her a kaiju tamer. From then on, when their companions witnessed what had happened to the girl, they began to see her as a savior. Fascinated by human behavior and emotions, the creature offered its protection in exchange for knowledge. With its command over fire, it was capable of keeping part of a territory warm, allowing humans to inhabit it. Check out these videos appearing on your screen and subscribe so you don't miss the next part.